Okay, we are now in chapter 13 of the Kindle book. This is a combo chapter of politics and the economy. We start off with a couple of terms that we often use interchangeably, but for this chapter, for us, we're going to want to use them separately. So, politics, which again is a social institution, we find some example of politics and political exchange in every single culture that we've ever studied. Government, which is a formal organization, which in modern societies tells us and uses us to say that's how we do politics. We use government, that's our formal organization, that's how we do it. That's how we do politics in our modern society. And then there's something called the state. You usually use the government and the state interchangeably, but the state is that which has a legitimate monopoly over use of force. Now, why that's important is often you'll see the change in state from, let's say, let's use the Egyptian example. Mubarak controlled Egypt for a long, long time, but then there was the Arab Spring, and then suddenly people no longer saw him and his use of force as being legitimate, and people took to the streets, and eventually the army took over, because the police were no longer able to keep the peace because no one saw them as legitimate arms of the state. So now we also have two new words that we're going to use differently: power and authority. Power, that's just my, simple way of getting and achieving what I want. And then there's authority, which is someone or something that's seen as legitimate rather than coercive in my use of power in society. So Weber talks about three different kinds of authority. Now, right away, dead German guy, ding, 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 right? So the first kind of authority he talks about is traditional authority. This is who gets to be king? That guy. Why? Well, his dad was king. Well, who voted for him? Nobody. His dad was king, and that's the tradition in our society. That's who gets to be king. Then there's something called charismatic authority. Now, this is a particularly troubling one because here, rather than even policies or some thing that you can point to as why someone gets to be in charge, it's just the sheer momentum of their charisma. And while it's hard for us to imagine this today, Adolf Hitler had an amazing charismatic authority. He would get up and speak, and go see those on YouTube, the old speeches of him at Nuremberg, and he would have tens of thousands of people eating out of the palm of his hands, not because his ideas were great. His ideas didn't really make much sense at all, but he delivered it with such conviction, and people believed in him so much. That's why. Now, that can obviously go a bad way. And your book also talks about the routinization of charisma. When charismatic authority is succeeded by a bureaucracy controlled by a rationally established authority or a combination of traditional and bureaucratic authority. It is the fate of charisma to recede. After that, it enters the permanent structures of social action. So in other words, after some charismatic figure takes over, often the successive government or state has this routinization of charisma where they bring back the person and put their pictures up and everyone gets excited. And often the North Korean regime, the first Kim, kept being recycled for the people because he was seen as such an important charismatic leader. Then there's what's called rational legal authority. This is where rather than a person or a tradition, we say laws. Laws are what's important, and laws are what we should find, and laws are what we should follow. And that's the reason that our government or our society works well together. So your book talks about monarchy. You can read that on your own. Authoritarianism versus totalitarianism. Sometimes there's a little confusion on this. Authoritarianism is I'm just a dictator or a military junta or group of oligarchs that take over. Then there's totalitarianism, and this is where like they want to rule everything, that you think and read and see. And they use the example of the Nazi Party. But I would also put KGB from the old Soviet period. I'm going to disagree with your book. Your book has the People's Republic of China as authoritarian. I actually am going to put them in the realm of totalitarianism. They do want to control everything that you think and see and read and get on the internet. And they try very hard to control information that goes through such a large country. And I've always said their secret police may be the most successful because while we know the names of like the KGB or the SS or the Gestapo, theirs, we don't even know their name. There's no name for the Chinese secret police. That's how secret they are. There's a discussion of democracy. Just remember that we have a representative democracy. We do not have a direct democracy. Then the book discusses different models of how these power systems came to be. So the first one they discuss is the pluralist model. This is where, all these different interest groups, sort of cancel each other out in our society. And that's what the functionalists believe, that, this political action committee cancels out that political action committee, and it's all great, it's all fine. But in fact, we don't find that. Particularly with the rise of what's called super PACs, now with the courts ruling that corporations have rights and rich people can funnel as much money as they want through these super PACs and not ever have to tell anybody, that now truly the rich are controlling a lot, and there isn't any real canceling that out. So what are we left with? We're left with the conflict perspective and something called the elite model. C. Wright Mills, bingo, University of Texas. C. Wright Mills and the power elite. He comes up with this idea in the late 1950s where he says he just made a list of the top 100 people and he looked in their background and he found out something very interesting. Number one, not a shock, all men, but men that went to Ivy League schools from upper class or upper middle class backgrounds and from the Northeast. And they also went to like prep schools and they belonged to the same social clubs. And when you dissect that, then you start realizing that even if there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans, they're really not that far off. There's what some people like Noam Chomsky have called the big business party, and one way to vote for it, or two ways to vote for it. You can do a Democrat way or a Republican way, but pretty much the interest of big business will be served. And so C. Wright Mills came up with the power elite, where he made that list of people, and people say, oh, well, it must have gotten better since the 1950s. William Domhoff came up with the ruling class, continued his work, and found out that the controlling group actually it's gotten more dense, not more democratic, and that the rich have coalesced around groups of people that want the same things. And even in our own current election, now it looks like between the big banks backed by Joe Biden, who's always been a friend of the banking industry, or the banking and real estate interest, business interest supported by Donald Trump. But the idea of a person jumping in there and getting the little guy's opinion, I don't know, it's not looking too good. So then there's discussion of the political party system, and since I often talk gloom and doom, here's something positive I'll say. We do have a rather unique history that for 200 years we've actually exchanged power peacefully. That the person to control the White House never said, you know what, I like living in the big White House. I don't care if I lost the election. I'm not moving. And that's actually really nice. That makes us kind of unique. Political socialization, we don't have a big political turnout here in the United States compared with some other nations. Some talk about the socialization of being basically so red and blue that it's contributed to voter apathy. So read about that. And then that'll bring us to a discussion of the iron triangle of power, which we'll pick up in our next section.